Hi, and welcome to the Psychology module for this Foundations of Science course. In this module, we'll be looking at concepts of psychology like bias, and seeing what they can tell us about the beliefs that are out of the ordinary, in this case, the idea of witches. We hope that by the end of this module, you'll be able to do the following. Did you ever sleep with a nightlight on? Or remember having a parent or older sibling check under your bed for monsters? Ever look up at the full moon on Halloween thinking you'll spot a witch flying across the night sky? Ever jump out of your seat while watching a horror movie even though you know it's just a movie? Perhaps you've used magical protective pillow to shield yourself from evil monsters that could leap from the TV at any moment. I remember as a kid seeing the movie Poltergeist and being scared to death of clowns for most of my childhood, made going to McDonald's a rather frightful experience as a kid. You might think that you are capable of knowing what is real and what is not. Yet, if you take a moment, I'm sure you'll be able to think of plenty of examples where you believed something to be real, or felt something to be real, only to realize later that your mind was playing a trick on you. Often the tricks our minds play on us, or the mental judgment errors we make, are small and harmless, but in other instances they can lead to dire consequences. To illustrate, we begin with the pseudoscience for this module on witches. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, though, it's probably good to first define science and pseudoscience. Science is a way of gaining knowledge about the world by identifying general principles or themes that are explanatory and predictive. And you might be saying, I'm not sure I know what that means. But essentially, science is a way of learning about our world. And by using scientific principles, we gain objective knowledge of how things work and why. For example, science helped us to establish that the world is round and that the sun is just a star that happens to be close to the earth. In contrast, pseudoscience literally means false science. Pseudoscientific beliefs may look like they are supported by science, but under closer inspection, they don't have a scientific basis. Believing in monsters under the bed can be thought of as pseudoscience. We may feel like there's something there, and we may think that we hear something making noises. However, if we actually worked up the courage to look under the bed, we might find some dirty clothes, but no monsters. Don't worry if these concepts seem a little bit fuzzy at this point, because the rest of the semester is geared towards helping you to understand the difference between these two ways of knowing. We most likely have all seen a number of movies, cartoons, or even musicals featuring witches flying through the night sky, brewing magical potions, and casting nasty evil spells on people. You'd be hard-pressed to make it through the month of October without seeing window decorations of witches, or Halloween without seeing kids in a variety of witch costumes going door to door and amassing piles of candy. Now, a child dressed as a witch on Halloween, believing the costume grants him or her magical powers for the day, may seem pretty harmless, and it probably is. But what if those same beliefs influence our way of thinking, where what we do is no longer harmless? Case in point, the Salem witch trials of 1692 in colonial Massachusetts, during which 14 women and 5 men accused of witchcraft were executed, while many more were imprisoned. Sarah Good, one of the accused and executed witches during the trials, was supposedly seen flying around on a stick. This atrocity may seem outdated, but you don't have to go all the way back to 1692 to find examples of where people's irrational belief of witches has resulted in horrifying consequences. In February of 2013, a 20-year-old mother living in the country of Papua New Guinea was accused of witchcraft and tortured and killed. Witchcraft accusations are often used in certain countries as a way to take away a woman's land and property, with often horrifying life-ending consequences. If you'd like to know more about stories like this, check out the additional resources folder for this week. Another example of how our minds are playing tricks on us can be demonstrated with the use of optical illusions. We've all probably stared at one or more optical illusions in magazines, or ones that have been sent to us in emails, and we stare at them and we may begin to see the picture moving, or we stare at them and then look at a wall to see a face mysteriously appear. We know the picture is not actually moving, or that a face hasn't magically appeared on the wall, and yet our mind makes us think these things are actually happening. Why is this? Well, as amazing and incredible as our brains are, they're not perfect and are capable of making mistakes. Optical illusions show us that using observation alone is not enough to make accurate decisions on. If it were, we would say the picture is actually moving even though it isn't, or we can be tricked into seeing things that aren't there. In contrast, sometimes we can miss seeing things that are actually there. To see an example of this, copy the following link into a browser window and follow the directions you are given. Click on the Continue button after you have watched to continue this presentation. So did you get the right number of ball passes?
More importantly, did you see the bear dance its way across the floor?
What we observe and remember is not always accurate, and often it's only an incomplete picture of what is actually occurring. Going back to our pseudoscience of witches, imagine that you were accused of being a witch because someone saw you talking to yourself. May sound crazy, but throughout history people have been accused of and persecuted for being witches based on observations made by others, inaccurate conclusions drawn from them. What we see is often not enough to make accurate decisions. This is where science and critical thinking can help us gather evidence and make better informed and more accurate decisions. We will discuss this idea more in depth later in this module. As pointed out earlier with the example of witches and optical illusions, our brains can easily make mistakes, sometimes mistakes with very harmful consequences. Another example of where our brains may play tricks on us has to do with accounts of UFO sightings, or unidentified flying objects, implying aliens, multidimensional beings, etc. While a discussion on the possibility of alien life is another scientific discussion, it's one that we will be saved for another lesson. However, it's important to look briefly at some potential psychological explanations to account for UFO sightings. For example, some people may see something in the sky and believe it to be a spaceship or some sort of UFO when it's actually just a weather balloon or a meteor shower. Move your cursor over the UFO to see perception processing errors that we are capable of making. If we do not gather additional evidence and use science and critical thinking to help correct the mistakes our brains are capable of making, we may very well perceive something incorrectly. UFO sightings can also at times be explained by certain mistakes our brains make routinely, which will be discussed later on. Our brains, although capable of making mistakes, are truly remarkable. The different parts of our brain work together to manage numerous electrical and chemical processes within our body. Everything we see, hear, feel, think, and experience are the result of these chemical processes in the brain. You know how when something scares you and your heart starts to race? Well, that heart racing is triggered by a chemical process in your brain, which in turn triggers other processes, such as the release of adrenaline into your system. What we do on a daily basis can significantly affect our brain chemistry. For example, drinking alcohol can result in seriously impaired vision, reflexes, memory, speech, and decision making, all because of the effect it has on the chemical processes in our brain. Perhaps you know of someone who takes medicine for depression or anxiety. They do this because of what is known about depression and anxiety points to chemical imbalances in one's brain, which may be improved by certain medications. Similarly, pain medications like Tylenol, aspirin, ibuprofen are taken because of their ability to reduce pain signals that travel to the brain. The take-home point from all of this is that your brain's biochemistry determines how you think and feel, sometimes in spite of the reality of your environment. Have you ever heard someone say it's mind over matter, or have you lost your mind? Perhaps you've seen the movie Freaky Friday, where a mother and daughter's minds switch bodies. Every day, common expressions in pop culture often frame our mind and body as two separate and distinct entities. The belief that our mind and body are separate entities commonly comes from the viewpoint that the mind is not physical, which is why movies and popular fiction sometimes show the mind of one person transferring bodies. However, sciences such as psychology and critical thinking are showing us that the mind and body are not separate and distinct entities. Our brain is made up of physical matter, and the processes that occur in our brain control our thoughts, feelings, dreams, and actions. For example, we know depressed people treated with antidepressant medications often experience less severe sadness. If the mind and body were separate, how would your body consuming something have an effect on the level of sadness your mind experiences? Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is an example of a serious injury that many people do not view as a physical injury, even though it can have serious physical effects. One way to think about PTSD is in relation to our fight or flight response. Fight or flight is a natural response aimed at keeping us safe. For example, let's say you're out for an evening run, and as you're crossing a street, you almost get hit by a car you didn't see turning around the corner. You may suddenly feel your heart start racing and a sudden burst of energy that causes you to jump or run faster. This is your fight or flight response kicking in, which alters the chemical processes occurring in your body to hopefully keep you safe by giving you an extra increased ability to flee danger or to stand your ground and fight. Once you realize you are okay, you'll probably calm down pretty quickly. But imagine if your fight or flight mechanism was being triggered by, let's say, being in a war zone. Now imagine you make it home from war, but your body is unable to turn off that fight or flight response. You find yourself regularly having nightmares, frightening thoughts, or flashbacks of traumatic events, or always feeling on edge or emotionally numb. These are just some of the symptoms of PTSD, which results in your body not being able to successfully manage your fight or flight mechanism in a healthy way. It's important to note that PTSD does not only occur in veterans of wars, although veterans are often afflicted with it. It can also occur in children and everyday adults who experience natural disasters, physical assaults, or losing a loved one. PTSD is a serious injury affecting millions of Americans annually. Research has shown that psychological trauma such as PTSD can have significant negative physical effects, such as poor heart, muscle, or bone health. These physical symptoms, effects of a psychological trauma, are more evidence our mind and body are not distinct entities. For additional information on PTSD, check out the Additional Resources folder for this module. Another fascinating example of our mind and body not being distinct entities has to do with what happens when a person's corpus callosum is separated. The corpus callosum is the part of the brain that connects the left and right side of your brain together. It turns out, when the corpus callosum is separated, some interesting things happen. The severing of the corpus callosum results in a condition referred to as split brain syndrome. If you show a person with split brain syndrome an object to her left eye, she won't be able to name the object, but she will be able to draw it with her left hand. You may wonder why this is. Well, the right and left sides of our brain are in charge of different things. As you can see, the right side of our brain controls the left side of our body, and the left side of our brain controls the right side of our body. The left side of our brain is also the analytical side and processes language, and the right side of our brain is the creative side. When the bridge between the two halves, the corpus callosum, is severed, the communication between the left and right sides of our brain is also severed. So when the person with split brain syndrome is shown an object to her left eye, which is controlled by the right side of the brain, she cannot name it because the language is controlled by the left side of the brain. Pretty interesting. You may be wondering why anyone would have their corpus callosum separated. Well, some people are born with a separated corpus callosum, while others opt to undergo surgery called a corpus callosotomy as a way to stop epileptic seizures. As you can see, the brain is an incredibly complex structure that allows us to interact with the world around us. The brain controls the processing of information coming from our senses, such as vision and hearing, and facilitates our ability to survive. However, just as the brain is responsible for our ability to assess our environment, and make critical observations and decisions, the brain is also capable of making mistakes and incorrect choices. As we described, physical changes in the brain can affect our ability to perceive reality, but a much more common issue is when our brain's processes influence or change our perception of reality. Let's revisit the example from earlier of optical illusions. As you look at this optical illusion, what was the first thing you saw? Was it a vase, or was it two faces staring at each other? Was it both? Neither? For this second image, do you see a spiral or rings? Are they moving or stationary? These illusions are easy examples of how our brain can be tricked into seeing things that aren't necessarily there, or perceiving the same sensory stimulus as multiple different things. As a third example, take a look at this paragraph. Can you read it? What does it say? Now move your cursor over the message and you'll see the corrected message. Isn't it incredible that we can read what the paragraph is saying even when the letters of the words are scrambled? At the same time, isn't it interesting that our brains create something logical from a bunch of randomly arranged letters? Our brains are able to see something that isn't actually there. We have to be careful because this same concept can apply to our perceptions of the world. Unfortunately, sometimes we aren't as logical as we like to think we are. Emotions or stress can affect our decisions. And this is often the case with stress eating, which occurs when our emotions result in disregarding future health implications by seeking immediate pleasure or comfort in the form of food. Our brains are also subject to many different kinds of biases, called cognitive biases. Cognitive bias can be thought of as irrationality. It's an error in judgment that might be the result of poor memory or falsely explaining causes of behaviors or events. With cognitive biases, we believe that we are logically processing information to come up to a correct conclusion, when in fact we're not. There are many different types of cognitive biases. In this unit, we'll learn about several, including the planning fallacy, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, bandwagon effect, subjective validation, availability error, representativeness heuristic, gambler's fallacy, and anthropomorphic bias. One type of cognitive bias that you probably experience all the time is the planning fallacy, where completing tasks tends to take longer than we plan. Remember the last time you had to stay up all night when the project that was only supposed to take you 3 hours ended up taking closer to 10? You were a victim of the planning fallacy. A second type of bias is the confirmation bias, where we tend to selectively search for and find information that supports our beliefs. For example, people with conservative political views tend to watch conservative news programs, while people with liberal political views tend to watch more liberal programs. In this way, both groups are further confirming their views while rejecting and/or ignoring evidence that supports the opposite view. This type of bias was often present in false claims of witchcraft. For example, people were often accused of witchcraft when strange things happened around that person, even though those same strange things would happen if the person wasn't around. The confirmation bias comes into play because we tend to not notice all the times that the event happens without that person around. For example, if I think that it rains every time I see Sally, I'll be looking for all the times it's raining when I see Sally, but I will forget or downplay any of the times where I see her and it wasn't raining. Another type of cognitive bias is the hindsight bias, or the belief that events are more predictable than they really are. As the popular expression goes, hindsight is 20/20. Every year, millions of people complete brackets to predict the results of the NCAA basketball tournament, which is college basketball. In 2013, no one in the world created a perfect bracket that correctly predicted the outcomes of all the games. In addition, only about 0.5%, that's 1 in every 200 people, picked the 15th seed Florida Gulf Coast to make the Sweet 16. However, after they won their first 2 games, announcers and fans touted how they knew Florida Gulf Coast had the talent to make it as far as they did. However, if it was really so obvious, why did so few people pick them to go so far in the tournament? Wouldn't it have been great if we had been able to predict that before it actually happened? If only it was so easy to predict these things. A fourth type of cognitive bias is the bandwagon effect, where a person is more likely to believe something if a lot of others believe it. Many companies promoting trends and fashions rely on the bandwagon effect to get people to want to buy or wear certain items when they see other people with them. Have you ever gone to a fortune teller or perhaps a palm reader? Or maybe you occasionally check out your horoscope in the daily newspaper or online. Let's say your horoscope says something like, "You will face challenges this month, but you will search for ways to deal with them, and you will be all the better for having done so." You may find yourself really making a connection with your horoscope because it just so happens that you have a big test coming up in school, or perhaps you've worked on a stressful project at work. So you find yourself thinking the horoscope is really accurate and valid. This is an example of another type of cognitive bias known as subjective validation. Subjective validation is where a person considers a statement or piece of information as true if he can find that it has any personal significance to him. If you take a step back and look at the statement from the previously mentioned horoscope, you'll probably notice it's a rather vague statement. Most people probably face challenges of some sort every single month of their lives and could find some personal connection to the horoscope. On second look, the horoscope appears to be a generalized statement that most people can find connection to, rather than an actual, accurate prediction of the future. Now imagine you're at a gas station, waiting to pay for your soda and chips, and you see the person in front of you scratching off the numbers on a lottery ticket. Suddenly the person erupts in joy, saying, "I won, I won." When you get to the cashier, you feel compelled to also buy a lottery ticket, though it's not something you usually do. One likely explanation to you buying a lottery ticket is the cognitive bias known as the availability error. Availability error occurs when people base judgments on vivid or memorable evidence rather than more trustworthy evidence, like statistics. For example, in the case of the lottery ticket, you might find yourself buying one because you just saw someone win. You base your decision on witnessing someone win rather than on the many more people who purchase losing lottery tickets every day. Basing decisions on information simply because it's memorable may lead to making errors in judgment. On another note, let's say you meet Jeff at a business conference and you start up a conversation. You find out Jeff is an outdoor enthusiast who loves hiking, snowy winters, and warm summers. Jeff asks you to guess where he's from, Alaska or Texas. You guess Alaska because you think Jeff's interests sound representative of someone living in that state, even though it's much more likely that Jeff lives in Texas, given that the population of Texas is 36 times higher than that of Alaska. Your conclusion is likely to be false, and it's the result of a cognitive bias known as the representativeness heuristic. The representativeness heuristic occurs when we estimate the likelihood of an event by comparing it to a scenario we already have in our minds. At times, the representativeness heuristic can be helpful by allowing us to make quick decisions based off of rules of thumb. However, they can also be very harmful and lead to stereotypes. For example, racism and bigotry are often rooted in a person's attributing his preconceived notions onto an entire group of people. Speaking of lottery tickets and odds, another common bias is the gambler's fallacy. This occurs when people assume that the odds of a random event change based on past events. For example, let's say that we have two-sided fair coin that will land on heads 50% of the time and tails the other 50% of the time. If we flipped the coin 10 times and get heads all 10 times, what are the chances that the 11th flip will also be heads? Some people think that the probability is very high, such as when gamblers keep playing when they're hot because they believe they'll keep winning. Conversely, other people think that the chances are very low. Since the first 10 flips were heads, flipping tails is more likely. This is like the gamblers who continue to play even after losing a bunch of money, because their luck has to change. Which one of these outlooks is correct? Well, neither. The fair coin has a 50% chance of landing on heads, regardless of what has happened in the past. The key point is that coin flips are independent events, meaning that previous coin flips have absolutely no bearing on the chances in that current coin flip.
In the scenario shown, is 1 or 2 a more likely sequence for 25 coin flips? I'm guessing that you picked 1, didn't you? Well, doing the math shows that each sequence is equally likely, since the coin flip is independent on previous flips.
One last type of bias that I'd like to introduce is one that occurs fairly often in everyday life. Remember the time you left your car lights on overnight and the battery was dead when you went to start your car the next day? What was the first thing you did? Did you curse at your car for not starting? Did you hit the steering wheel to punish the car for not starting? Do you believe that the car purposely didn't start or was plotting against you? If you've ever felt yourself in a situation similar to this, you've experienced anthropomorphic bias, or attributing human feelings, thoughts, emotions, or physical characteristics to a non-human object. When I was younger, my sister always talked about the angry clouds that were part of an approaching storm. While clouds certainly don't have emotions, I'll bet you can visualize a clear image of what an angry cloud might look like. Another example of anthropomorphic bias is called pareidolia, which involves interpreting a vague or random image or sound as having meaning. Ever seen a face on an object? How about this smile? Move your mouse over the picture to see the face outlined if you're having trouble seeing it. Our minds are really good at trying to create order and purpose out of randomness. Do you see the bird formed by the clouds? I hope by now you're starting to see how our brain can interpret or see things that aren't actually there. We need to be careful how we perceive situations because of the many cognitive biases that can affect our judgment. Luckily, such things as following the scientific method can help to minimize the risk of letting these cognitive biases influence our perceptions of reality. For more information on these biases or to learn about other cognitive biases, check out the links in the Additional Resources folder for this module.
We as people are naturally curious about the world around us. Our brains are incredibly good at using sensory information to gain an understanding of our world and function to keep us safe from danger and find ways of getting the things we need to survive. Our observations and beliefs influence our way of thinking, but they often offer an incomplete view of the world, as described earlier. This can lead to problems when information in the world is at odds with our perceived values, beliefs, or ideas, called cognitive dissonance. We often think of dissonance in music where two notes are close together but different, creating a tension that hurts our ears and makes us want to resolve it. For a sound clip of dissonance, check out the following link to a short video which plays both consonant and dissonant sounds. Similarly, our brain experiences cognitive dissonance when our favorite singer is accused of lip-syncing in a concert, or when our least favorite teacher wins an award for teaching excellence. Our perceptions and beliefs about the person don't match up with the reality of the situation, resulting in the dissonance. When our brain encounters this dissonance, it generally tries to make sense of the conflict by changing beliefs, developing new ideas, or reducing the importance of one or more of the dissonant elements. This reaction is called dissonance reduction, and it serves as a way of finding resolve when conflicting information is present. We might rationalize that the singer was sick, or that they only lip-synced so that the concert wouldn't have to be canceled, or that the teacher won the teaching award because there were no other teachers competing, or the panel of judges just didn't have the right information. In these examples, we're changing our beliefs and creating a situation which fits with our perceptions of the people, even if our new beliefs are not in reality true. Often when we cover phenomena that we don't necessarily understand, our brains strive to establish some kind of reason for the phenomena to resolve the dissonance we feel. Superstitions are a popular way of explaining success or failure at a certain task, even though no rational connection can be determined. For example, finding a four-leaf clover is often a sign of good luck. Also, a roommate of mine in college used to wear the same underwear without washing it while his sports team was on a winning streak. Some of them are quite gross. While superstitions are usually harmless, There are many examples of superstitions or beliefs used to describe unknown phenomena that have caused great pain and suffering in society. Returning to our pseudoscience of witches, belief in witchcraft and magic still exists in many parts of the world today. While witches and wizards have been sensationalized by recent popular fantasy stories, witches have been persecuted, tortured, and killed for much of history. Witches were often blamed for causing things such as sickness, extreme weather, and bad harvests. Once people suspected someone of being a witch, it was common to use natural things such as unusual scars, birthmarks, or unusual behavior as evidence of witchcraft. Tortured confessions were also used to convict suspects of witchcraft. As you can see, all of the evidence against witches is based on false interpretations of observations made by others. Along these same lines, both confirmation bias and the bandwagon effect contributed to the mass hysteria that fueled the search and execution of those believed to be witches. Falsely attributing naturally occurring events to supernatural causes resulted in many people being wrongly persecuted as witches. It is estimated that as many as 500,000 people were killed in Europe alone during the 15th to 17th centuries. While these events happened hundreds of years ago, there are modern-day examples of strange events being attributed to witchcraft in developing countries. For some recent examples, you can take a look at the link provided or in the additional resources folder for this module. Another example of emotionally driven mass hysteria is the hype and fear around the latest end-of-the-world prediction, when the Mayan calendar finished on December 21st, 2012. Although many prominent, smart, and respected people publicly discussed the irrationality of the Mayans being able to accurately predict the end of the world when they haven't existed as a people for hundreds of years, it didn't stop many from stocking up on provisions or spending excessively in anticipation of the impending apocalypse. I hope the examples I've given illustrate the dangers of simply relying on our brains and our own experience and beliefs to determine truths and facts about the world. We need a more objective way to learn, and science and critical thinking may provide the tools we need to accomplish this goal. As we've previously discussed, science has several basic premises. 1. The world and the universe are real, whether we can sense them or not. 2. It's possible for us to understand the physical universe. 3. The natural world can be explained by natural processes. Non-natural processes aren't needed. And 4. Knowledge of the physical universe is available to everyone. We'll not focus on these in detail in this module, but it's important to remember that science provides us with a method of learning about the natural world and a way of organizing facts into meaningful patterns. As such, science, when conducted correctly, involves a systematic and planned effort to make discoveries and increase our understanding of the world through controlled observations, like experiments and studies, and physical evidence of natural phenomena. From these observations, we can develop and test theoretical explanations or theories of how things work. As we've shown in this module, it's important that we learn about how the brain works to be able to understand human emotion, thinking, called cognition, behavior, and personality. Psychology allows us to study many of the biases we looked at before in order to understand when and why they occur, and take steps to minimize their influence on our ability to learn about the world. Science is an important and useful way to learn about the world for a number of reasons. First, science is empirical and objective, meaning that it's based on observations and not on wishful thinking or irrationality. It also has a systematic approach to reduce the cognitive biases mentioned earlier. Second, science is repeatable, so people who are skeptical or unsure of a discovery can scientifically test it and see if they find the same thing. Third, science is self-correcting. Initial findings may give us an idea about what we're trying to understand, but these findings and ideas are often modified and refined based on new evidence and continued testing. In this way, errors that occur will be found and corrected so that our understanding can be improved. Science may not always give us perfect answers the first time we try to understand something, But with continued work and refinement, we can get closer and closer to the truth. Not too long ago, we used to think that the Earth was flat, and if you reached the end of the world, you could topple off the edge of the Earth. Our limited ability to observe the Earth's shape made it perfectly reasonable to think that the Earth was flat. Before planes and spaceflight, we couldn't easily see that the Earth was curved. However, scientific thinking and careful monitoring of the sun's path led the ancient Greeks to believe that the Earth was curved, and the famous circumnavigation of the globe by a ship captained by Ferdinand Magellan in the 1500s finally convinced many that the Earth was not flat. Even though the Earth looked flat, scientific thinking and experimentation were able to overcome our limited perceptions and help us arrive at the correct conclusion about the shape of the Earth. However, despite the importance of science for development of knowledge, scientific progress can be hindered when science is conducted poorly. A famous example of poorly conducted science resulting in false conclusions is the N-ray, first described by Prosper René Blondlot in 1903. Blondlot was a physicist who thought he'd discovered a new form of radiation while he was conducting experiments with X-rays. He called them N-rays. Once he made this discovery, many other physicists started reporting similar findings, resulting in close to 300 papers in support of the existence of N-rays. However, many prominent scientists of the day were unable to replicate the results, prompting a fellow physicist named Robert Wood to travel to Blondlot's lab to witness his experiments. Before the experiment started, Wood removed one of the vital pieces of equipment, without Blondlot's knowledge, that was needed to detect the N-rays, but Blondlot still reported seeing the N-rays. Once Wood reported what he'd done, interest in and hype around N-rays quickly disappeared. N-rays are a prime example of the confirmation bias and serve as a reminder that our experiences and beliefs can bias our outlook. We need science and critical thinking to fight these biases that inevitably pop up so that we can continue to gain objective knowledge about our world.